Hello, welcome. Can you believe we're already in week 6? The time is going by very, very fast. This week we're going to talk about strategic family therapy. And one of the things I was thinking about, again, still thinking about licensure, is part of the game is to figure out which words go with which models. There's there's some parallels, some similar ideas across models, but people may say it differently, reframing versus restoring and so forth. So you want to learn the sort of the vocabulary for each model. Okay, let's jump in with this though. So what is strategic therapy? Some of the basics about that. Who's responsible for change that happens in therapy? In strategic therapy, as we get into it, you'll see that the therapist takes more responsibility for that. Whereas in other models, they believe most of the responsibility for change is the client. Strategic therapy is any type of therapy where the therapist initiates what happens during therapy and designs a particular approach for each problem. As Haley wrote in Uncommon Therapy, really a really great book, and I highly recommend it. It's got some great, just basic therapy skills. But he wrote, strategic therapy isn't a particular approach or theory, but a name for the type of therapy where the therapist takes responsibility for directly influencing people. So I could see that as a test question. In the 1950s, therapists had began to study the environment of a patient, not just the patient himself, which was actually a pretty significant shift. The theory of the strategic therapist states that the patient's symptoms are a result of attempts by the family members to correct what they consider problem behavior. This is where, obviously with his involvement with the MRI, there's some parallels with attempted solutions. Haley's strategic therapy focuses on short-term targeted efforts to solve a specific problem. From a strategic perspective, normal families are flexible enough to modify solutions that do not work and flexible enough to adjust to development, which I don't want to add to confusion, parallels some of the things we talked about last week. They really did focus on positive feedback loops, hierarchy, and structures in family. People can be temporarily off track. Symptoms are the result of misguided attempts at changing an existing difficulty, and attempted solutions to the problems are what really maintain the problems. So, a therapist employing strategic therapists, the tasks that they must engage in are first identifying solvable problems. What are you here for? What is the problem that you would like addressed? And then you set goals, and then you design interventions to achieve those goals. So the therapist isn't the one coming up with what should be different. They're listening to there's not really a problem to be solved unless the client's identifying one. Strategic therapy seeks rapid change. It utilizes resistance to bring about change, and we'll go into that. Positive feedback loops. If you're not familiar with this, it's students, schools, families encounter many difficulties over the course of their lives, but whether or not it's a difficulty becomes a problem that's in need of intervention depends on how members respond to it. So you might ask questions like, I have some guesses about how this might be a problem, but for you, how is it a problem? Because you want to know from their perspective. Like maybe you think, okay, this person's partner is having an affair, and you may think that the problem is the infidelity, but it might actually be more the money that they're spending on the other person. That's an example. Misguided attempts to solve problems are when you're making assumption about what the problem is rather than listening to the client's definition of it. And attempted solutions are trying more of the same. It creates a vicious cycle. So what Haley would do is he would try to unbalance the system. Unbalance creates problem, but he would also unbalance it again so it could reform in a way that's more functional, more okay for the family. That wasn't very clear, but I hope you get my point. Communications define relationships. There's verbal and nonverbal. They're specific or vague. Maybe if someone is unclear in their communications, instead of saying, could we stop and get something to eat because I'm hungry, they would say, are you hungry? Problems arise when meaning isn't shared. Like people may be thinking because they're using the same words, that they are talking about the same thing, but there may be different meanings applied to those. So sometimes in problematic families, there are rules that are in play, but they're not overt. So part of the effort would be to make implicit rules explicit. And it's also in families, sometimes you have to talk about, well, what are the agreements of this family, meta rules, rules for making rules. And how, like, for example, I think I've used this example before, but maybe what worked with a 12-year-old no longer is working with a 17-year-old. So you might just bring up that it seems like there's a rule that people in your family, that there's a curfew, maybe that's a better example. There's a curfew. Um, and that rule got set when the child was 12. But how do you adapt the curfew as your child moves closer to adulthood? And then have a conversation about that. Goals of strategic therapy. Uh, One of the things you need to understand is first order change versus second order change. First order change is just a change of the behavior of a behavior, but it still makes sense in the overall rules of the system. Where a second order change might be actually changing the system. You also need to really be careful of homeostasis and the symptom appearing elsewhere in the system. So, for example, if there's a son that's getting bad grades, they come to therapy, the son starts to get better, then maybe that symptom of the son having problems serves some sort of function in the system. And so the problem just sort of migrates to the daughter, and she starts to do bad in class. Because so you need to address the reason why a particular symptom is in existence. The main goal of therapy is for people to behave differently. You're not necessarily they're going back and trying to make deep psychological meanings about this. You're not trying to find out the why of why a particular problem is happening. You're trying to get them to do something different so that the problem doesn't exist. The role of the strategic therapist is to encourage discussions and in order to resolve conflicts. You need, like in all models, to be a reasonably impartial advisor. Um, Again, I like the phrase of Naj's best, multidirectional partiality, but if you heard that, then you would know it's coming from Naj instead. Assist clients to examine motivations they have, but are not aware of. But insight isn't the main aim of this. It's awareness. Make clients' manipulative maneuvers explicit and more difficult to employ. Oh, it seems like every time I ask you a question, your sister answers for you. Has she always been the person in charge of your voice? Okay. Um, Another goals are to facilitate clients' ability to deal with sensitive topics. The use of paradox, and there's lots of different kinds of use of paradox, like prescribing the symptom, like if maybe someone's coming in for depression and they've been crying, you might say, well, it doesn't, to me, it makes sense that you are troubled by crying uncontrollably, but given what's been going on, I'm not sure you've cried enough. Maybe we need to schedule some time this week where you just really have some time to do focused crying. The primary responsibility for change is on the therapist. So I like that because that's sort of a shift away from what historically had been client blaming. You're instead taking responsibility. It's very active. It's very directive. You're very, very engaged in when you're doing this kind of work, when you're doing strategic work. And then you're setting out to achieve specific objectives. Part of this is you also you have to think about yourself as part of the system. So they didn't language itself of the therapist, but that's kind of where I think of some of the origins of the idea of self-therapist might come from these earlier theories. That you're aware of your own philosophies and how those guide what you do and what you don't do in your clinical work. Now, sometimes it sounds a little colder, but that's not my experience. If you watch any of the old tapes, I think they're actually often quite warm and trusting in the ways that they form their relationships. But they do that in some ways by being a more intense sort of presence in the room. They're potent and credible. They're directive and they're sort of controlling what's happening in the room. It's not to sit back and be led by the the client. And I know there's critiques of that, but I think you could also critique the reverse. I've heard of a lot of people stopping therapy because they didn't feel like the therapist was active enough. They were just sitting there and agreeing and being supportive, which has a role, but sometimes people come in because they need an influence for change in their lives. So question your critiques of that. Because I think sometimes that gets dominated and we don't see the value of this approach. You thrust yourself into the system. You become the third party in the triangle, and you try to stabilize until you're able to exit. Okay, it's really important how you start therapy. Therapy must begin properly. Interview as many people in the system as possible. And then there's four main stages, and of course there's variants. It's never quite as neat in practice as it is in a book. But the four stages are the social stage: make clients feel comfortable, observe their initial interactions. But they say that, but as I've watched, sometimes that stage is very, very short. So, did you have any problems finding the clinic today? Okay, no. Well, what brings you in today? So, but it's still warmth, and so I don't think it only stops at the very first. Like, I think some of these intertwine. The problem stays: introduce self, tell the family what you want, what you know about them. Uh, Look for any cues for triangles or hierarchy that's going on in the system that might not be serving them well. And the therapist doesn't comment or interpret too much at that stage. Then there's an interaction stage. Ask to discuss, sort of like Minuchin's enactment. Ask them to discuss a point of view among themselves. Observe their interactions, and you're looking for process versus content. Like, it's not so much the words that are important, but all the other messages that give those words meaning. Like, maybe they're saying one thing but rolling their eyes, and maybe their tone of voice, like all the other things that give the content meaning. And then there's a goal setting stage, where you might give them homework or a task to do at the end of the session. Yeah, and so forth. Okay. Some other parts of how intervening happens from a strategic perspective. You're, as a therapist, you must be a fair participant. You're going to model ways of interacting that are useful. You want to find out what solutions that they have tried but haven't been successful, so that you don't prescribe them. And then you're going to try and give them new meanings, like the interactions. Like, maybe if a couple comes in and they say they want to stop arguing, you would re-argue arguing as increasing intimacy. Um, you may say couples who don't argue are actually the ones that really scare me, because I'm more concerned about them. I can see that you are going through an important passage in your relationship, but I see this arguing as something that could really actually be useful for increased intimacy. Try to break out of an impossible situation. Like, if they come in and say they just want to be they want to be happy all the time, you might say, I'm not able to really do that, but we might be able to increase the number of times during the week when you experience happiness. Uh, Instead of continuing to repeat patterns that do not work, help them to experiment trying something else or that's new. Emphasize any success that they have. So if they come in, they've had 10 days since you last saw them where they were arguing, but one of those days they didn't argue, then that's the day I'm going to focus on the most. And I guess I've already given examples of that. You're going to track the sequences and give directions to alter. So if you notice that every time someone does something nice, their partner criticizes them, maybe you're going to give it a homework assignment that each time you experience that your partner's trying to do something nice, even if it's not quite how you would want to do it, I want you to go into the kitchen and open the drawer and take out a spoon and give yourself a scoop of ice cream. Like, I mean, it really doesn't matter what you have them do as long as it's something different than what they historically have been doing. And sometimes strange assignments like that actually interrupt because, and then you give a rationale for it sometimes. Or sometimes you say, hey, I'm going to give you an assignment, but I'm going to ask you not to ask me for the reason. I just want you to experiment with it. It may or may not be helpful. Yeah. The directive depends on the therapist's power and authority. If you've been able to gain that with a client, you have a lot more power to do things. Persuade them to carry out a task. They must believe that they will gain something by cooperating. So you have to work on how you might do that. Sometimes, like I think I've shown some of you the behavioral cycle where I'll map out the cycle of behaviors, and then I'll ask them, okay, this week I don't want you to do anything different than just notice how many times the sequence happens. The goal is to try to get them to disobey you in some way. So if they don't act out the cycle, then that's successful. And if they do act out the cycle, then they still win. So I don't know how much y'all have been using paradoxical interventions. I actually really be curious about that. There's so many different ways to do it. Now, there's a great article that I really like that's called "Why Do We Even Call Them Paradoxes Anymore?" Better title, but that's the gist. Why do we call them paradoxes anymore? I think of it as you're giving a different rationale, but from a very logical place. So if it just feels like reverse psychology, then I think you're doing bad therapy. But if you're giving them instructions to do something with a good rationale, like like telling them that arguing helps them gain intimacy, I could actually believe that. So I'm not lying or manipulating. I'm giving them a perspective that's different than what they've done before. So client therapist relationship is defined as one that brings about change. Problems are clearly defined. Goals are clearly defined. The therapist offers a plan, usually with a thought out rationale. And then the therapist gracefully disqualifies the current authority on the problem. So if there's someone who says, well, this is the way it has to be, say, well, maybe, I could see why you would see it that way. And it sounds like in many cases that would apply. It doesn't seem to be working in the situation. So maybe we could just experiment with something else. You'd have to work on your language a little bit, but you're solely saying, like, with your authority, that there might be more than one way to see the situation. And then you give them a directive or a paradox. The responses are observed, and the therapist continues to encourage unusual behavior. And then if anytime a change happens, I always give credit to them. Like, they'll come in and maybe praise the impact of the last session. And I'll say, well, we only met for 15 minutes. So I'm fairly confident that you both were doing something really different this week. And maybe we just haven't figured out all the different things that you were doing. But I know enough to know that it wasn't just because of those 50 minutes. Let's see if we can figure out the other things. Avoid minimizing problems. Like, sometimes we do this accidentally by trying to be hopeful too much. Oh, yeah, I know this is really hard and you've been suffering it for 7 years, but I think we could take care of this in a week. There's something sort of, the client might have to convince you of the seriousness of the problem if you minimize it. So really, no matter what it is, wow, you know what, that is really difficult. I think maybe last time I was going a little too fast, not understanding how difficult this challenge is. I say things like, given everything you've just told me, I don't even know how you were able to make it here. How are you not curled up in a ball in the corner in your house? Just having enough energy to be able to come and talk to someone, I imagine, was hard. That's a very difficult thing that you're struggling with. Avoid abstractions. Try and use specific language. Avoid constant coalition with one part of the system. This isn't mentioned again in every theory because it's so commonly done that people take sides and they think they're doing good therapy. If you take sides, you might shame someone into changing their behavior, but it won't lead to deep change and it won't last. So think about that, about why it's important to really try to have each person in the system feel heard and understood, and that you understand why they're doing the things that they're doing. Avoid debates about life or the whys or deep philosophical things, at least from the strategic approach. Really avoid the past. You don't like, you might still do some history gathering, but your goal is to really just find out what are the patterns that are happening currently. And therapists should really not try to be wiser than they are, or to appear they are than they are. Like sometimes I've noticed this, particularly with young therapists, that they feel like they need to put on airs about their competence. But the more you try and convince someone of your competence, it's likely less they're going to see you. I think you always gain people's respect when you take a one down. Like, I don't know. I'm able to be helpful with some people. I'm not always helpful with others. I have some ideas. Let's see, and you can give me feedback whether it's working for you. You know a lot more about this situation than I do. So let's think of these as sort of experiments. Avoid unformulated goals like being happy, feeling in love, like just nebulous sort of things. Okay, so what's the most concrete thing that could change this week that would let you know that things are getting better? Okay, he would put away the dishes after washing them. Okay, let's put that down as the goal for this week. Avoid allowing irreversible decisions. Like don't take a side so absolute that you can't backtrack.